Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a game designer with an overactive imagination and a deep love of history. And as it just so happens, Age of Empires 2 is the perfect arena for those two intrinsic elements of my soul to intersect. Today, as we so often do, we are going to be creating a theory-crafted civilization. Today's civilization idea comes from a suggestion from a commenter, NC, who asked that I do a Nordic civ of some kind. NC, thank you so much for the suggestion, my man. Thank you so much for the comment. Keep on watching. I look forward to hearing from you in future. And taking him up on his suggestion, today we are going to be taking a look at the Swedes. Now, you might say to yourself, aren't the Vikings already in-game? Well, the Swedes will be one of a multi-part split of the current Viking civilization. We'd effectively be giving the Vikings the Indians treatment here. So today we'll just be sticking with the Swedes, but perhaps in future we will revisit the Danes, the Norwegians, etc. As per usual, links to my civilization document down below can be found if you want to take a look at the full tech tree, a couple of the more specific numbers, and some other miscellaneous details that this presentation won't get into. But before we move further, a couple of disclaimers as always. I am not a historian, my designs are completely untested, and I have done this without consulting any other builds of the Swedes out there on the internet. So hopefully these should be entirely original ideas. As a game developer, I like complexity, I want to increase variety, and I always like to try to translate history as directly to game mechanics as possible. With that all being said, let's move on to a little bit of an overview of Swedish history in the Middle Ages. So the Swedish kingdoms are first recognized to have formed somewhere around the 800s AD. There were a bunch of peoples who were living in Sweden at that time, and among them, the northern Svea seems to have won the overall conflict. The Goethe, who leave their name in places like Gotland, and the Goths, as they were known when they migrated south, left their own impact on European history. And the Wends were another name for the local Slavic peoples who came across the Baltic to settle parts of the Swedish peninsula a little earlier during the Iron Age. But among these three peoples, the Svea, the true Swedes, triumphed eventually. You could even in some ways lay the blame for elements of the Great Migration south on this particular conflict, though the true consolidation of Svea power happened well after the major southern migrations of Gothic and Germanic peoples into southern Europe, including the Lombards, who could trace their origins to the Swedish islands and would eventually leave a massive imprint on Rome and Italy. If you want to see more about the Lombards, I did a build of them a little while ago. Link should be found up here. With their position in Scandinavia now established, the Svea looked elsewhere. All of Europe and Transoxiana was available to them through river and sea routes. Shipbuilding was always a massive part of Scandinavian culture, and the Svea were no exception, leading to a massive exodus of merchants and raiders in what we know as the Viking Age. Now, there are many, many peoples who participated in the Viking Age, among them the Danes and Norwegians, of course. In fact, we obviously had a whole civilization named after the Viking Age, though bear in mind, the term Viking is not a people, it refers to a profession. A Viking was a raider, merchant, effectively. Vikings from all of the Scandinavian countries made it everywhere. Like, there wasn't a clear divide between who went where and who did what. But for simplicity's sake, we will be focusing on the East, where Sweden and Swedish peoples tended to be in the majority of the Viking populations. They made a huge imprint on the eastern regions, starting with the Baltic states. There were a whole load of local Slavic peoples who would become abundantly familiar with the Swedes over the coming decades and centuries. In the Slavic regions, the Swedish Vikings were known as the Rus, or people of the ore, roughly translated. And these Rus would eventually found a major trading outpost called Kiev. This city of Kiev would eventually become a major power seat for them in the region, and as such, they settled down and became the Kievan Rus, from whose name we eventually would derive Russia. From Slavic lands, they would make their way south, coming into contact with Byzantium. Very famously, Byzantine emperors would surround themselves with an elite bodyguard made up predominantly of Swedish Vikings. These were the Varangian Guard, an incredibly loyal, oath-bound corps who would pledge their service to whatever emperor was seated on the throne at the time. They did all sorts of stuff in the Mediterranean that we won't get into too much detail about here, but suffice to say that the Varangian Guard was an incredibly important part of the Byzantine legacy. The Swedish Vikings wouldn't just stop at Byzantium. No. They would move further into the east of the Black Sea, with some sources citing evidence that Swedish Vikings made it as far southeast as India, though that I do not know for certain. What is known for certain is that they had abundant contact with the Muslim states as well as with the Persian Empire. This would be as far south as the Swedish Vikings would consistently penetrate, and with these peoples, they would deal very heavily in slaves and silks and spices and all sorts of stuff that they could then bring back north. Now, from all of this trading and raiding, the Swedish Vikings would grow filthy rich, and this wealth would eventually gravitate back to Sweden proper. But with all of this wealth and power came other influences, especially that of Christianity. The Swedes had a very interesting relationship with the Christians. Attempts to Christianize them had been made by German states as early as 800, but it wasn't until well after the turn of the millennium that Swedes officially adopted Christianity as their true religion. Though when I say true religion, that is missing part of the picture. For the Swedish peoples, it seems as though Christianization was a choice of opportunity rather than one of faith. They did it in order to gain greater contact and influence with European states, as well as to protect themselves from crusading powers eager to drive pagans from European soil. It's very clear, though, that pagan traditions lasted much longer in Sweden than they did in many other parts of Europe. Swedish kings and church officials were very reluctant to stomp out pagan traditions during this period, and even well after, and you can still see evidence of these deep pagan roots in modern Sweden today. However, as another benefit of Christianization, the Swedes now had the ability to launch crusades. And with crusading came another opportunity to enrich themselves through raiding, which, as we know, was a huge part of how they gained their wealth in the first place. The Swedes made many attempts to take on eastern territories held by Lithuania, Novgorod, and the Finnish Sami peoples. For the most part, these military actions were very successful and led to Sweden gaining further territory and enriching itself even more than it had done during the Viking Ages, especially now that that wealth was filtering into a centralized power rather than being held by the individual raiders who claimed it in the first place. Sweden's territory at one point was looking pretty substantial, encapsulating all of Sweden we know today, as well as a big chunk of Finland and even parts of modern Russia. That wasn't to say that Swedish power was completely unopposed, however. Not only did they constantly fight with Norway and Denmark, and I do mean constantly fought with Norway and Denmark, but eventually another rival would challenge their dominance within the Baltic, that being the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League was a confederation of northern German city-states that took massive dominance over the trade routes in the Baltic and in northern Europe, and were gaining even greater economic power in the region than Sweden itself. And of course this couldn't stand. And so what Sweden did is it agreed to an incredibly opportunistic bid by the Danes to join the Kalmar Union, a confederation of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, all under the rulership of, coincidentally, a king of Denmark, that would, on paper at least, allow them to rival the dominance of the Hanseatic League in Northern European trade. And this it did do. But as you might imagine, being that they constantly fought with each other up until this point, the Swedes and Norwegians were not very happy being ruled by the Danes, and this eventually culminated in Sweden's breakaway attempts. And initially, these were just attempts. They were squashed pretty quickly by Danish royal troops allied with various other northern European powers. And so these rebellions would take almost 80 years, a big chunk of Sweden's late Middle Ages. Normally, when you think of a situation like this, you think of the oppressor and the rebels fighting each other with no other outside influence, but not in this case. The Swedish rebellion against the Kalmar Union would eventually involve almost every power in the Baltic, but finally, in 1523, Sweden succeeded in throwing off Danish yoke under the rulership of the charismatic and talented King Gustav Vasa. They quickly reclaimed much of their lost territory and then made even further inroads in modern Estonia, allowing Sweden to end the AoE2 relevant time frame, namely 1600 AD, in a very dominant position within Northern Europe. And so while Sweden's medieval history was very turbulent, it ended up in a very powerful position. Moving on from their history overview, let's take a look at how this would translate to flavor in-game. To start off, Swedish architecture would be, of course, Central European, with unique skins for the castle and the dock. The Swedes are a naval civilization. Shipbuilding is in the blood and has been since practically the Stone Age, and it just wouldn't make sense for them to not have some sort of special nod to this affinity for the sea. Their language would be Old East Norse. Kveda, ladies and gentlemen. Old East Norse is distinct from the Old Norse that is spoken in-game right now, in that what we see right now is predominantly Western Norse, the stuff that would have been spoken mostly by the Norwegians and a little bit by the Danes. So this could hopefully give the Swedes a bit of a unique linguistic flair in the face of their fellow Scandinavian sisters. Their wonder is a little bit of an interesting one. I think the best pick would be the Temple of Uppsala. This was a central part of Swedish paganism that the Christians didn't dare mess with for centuries, even after Swedish Christianization. And even eventually, when it did fall, it was turned immediately into a Christian church. I have two potential pictures for this. On the left is an artist's reconstruction of how it might have looked during pagan times. On the right, a much later reconstruction of the church that was built in its place. And I think that some sort of combination of the two could be very cool as a way of both allowing their wonder to stand out from other civs in-game currently, as well as, more importantly, showing the interesting gray line that formed between paganism and Christianity in the Swedish lands. Moving on to campaigns, everyone's favorite. What would be a good way to represent Sweden in an Age of Empires 2 campaign? Well, I have two potential options for you today, the first of which I think is very strong. Birger Jarl. This man was arguably the first true king of a unified Sweden. Because even after the Svea won way back in 800, there were still all sorts of regional disputes, and one king being one place and another king being another place. This man, Birger Jarl, consolidated all of it. He was one of the first Christian Swedish kings and initiated the first Swedish crusade into Finnish territory. He was incredibly powerful, influential, and wielded Christianity as an incredibly effective tool to broker power in Europe, as well as use it to legitimize warfare. His early life was very fraught, as his claim to the Swedish throne was heavily contested. However, he prevailed and left his impact as arguably the most influential Swedish king until the Vasa era. I think he's a great pick as the protagonist of a Swedish campaign. But there is another option besides him, that being the collapse of the Kalmar Union. Rather than focusing on a single protagonist, I thought it would be interesting to show a Swedish campaign with a different protagonist every scenario or two, representing the various Swedish kings that attempted to throw off Danish rule over the 75 years of rebellion that followed Sweden's attempted exit from the Kalmar Union. Now, this would be a little unconventional, not to mention it would absolutely mandate the Danes being a civilization in-game for the Swedes to fight against. I think it would be a great way to show off not only an exceptionally defining part of Swedish history, but also the rotating cast of characters that left a huge impact on the entire process of Swedish freedom. Again, an unconventional campaign, and perhaps it could be a flop. I know people tend to favor single protagonists, but it absolutely bears mentioning as a potential rival to the obvious pick of Birger Jarl. In terms of existing campaigns, I could think of a couple where a Swedish civilization could figure, but not too many. In Bari 3, there is an entire faction of Varangian guards that would obviously be a good pick for the Swedes, and that's literally it. Weird, right? You'd think that the Vikings would have been everywhere, they should feature in so many scenarios, but right now there are only two that actually have the Vikings as protagonists, namely York and Vinland Saga, and both of those should be the Danes and Norwegians respectively. So as of now, the game is very light on Swedes. But I think that if the Viking civilization were subdivided into Swedes, Danes, and Norwegians, there would be tons of potential appearances for the Swedes. So just to reiterate, Vinland Saga and York should not star the Swedes. There are also a couple of other campaigns that I could see potentially working for the Swedes, either instead of or in addition to the two that I listed. Eric the Saint was another Swedish king, the very first completely Christianized Swedish king. He mostly fought against other Swedes, so I think a campaign of his might be a little bit boring, but it could be a cool way to demonstrate the conflicts that occurred between paganism and Christianity during the country's messy Christian adolescence. On the other side of this coin would be blot-sweyn. He was the last pagan king of Sweden who seized the throne from what he considered to be a Christian usurper and famously committed the last traditional animal sacrifice of all the pagan kings of Sweden before being surrounded and killed in retribution by his supplanted rival. I don't think blot-sweyn's story has enough meat to fuel an entire campaign, but as a single one-off scenario, I think it would be fantastic. And again, I love the conflict between paganism and Christianity in Swedish history. So much storytelling potential, so much intrigue. I think it could be a really great thing to add in, even just as a one-off, like a Battles of the Conquerors style single scenario. We then have another Eric, this one Eric the Victorious. He is the earliest known Swedish king, according to actual archived documents, and he spent most of his time invading Denmark and consolidating Swedish power in the south. A little bland, but he bears mentioning, especially if an earlier time period is desired for a Swedish campaign or scenario. And with that, we have flavor out of the way. Let's move on to the major themes. What did I learn? What patterns did I see when I was studying Swedish history? Well, first and foremost, raiding and seafaring. First you had the Vikings, then you had the Crusaders. The Swedes gained massive wealth and influence by raiding their neighbors and then making new neighbors when their old neighbors ran out of money. Shipbuilding was central to Sweden's identity for a huge part of its history, again, ever since the Stone Age. And so having seafaring as a major part of the civilization's identity was an absolute must. And speaking of wealth, the Swedes had consistent economic dominance over both the Baltic region and Northern Europe more broadly. They traded constantly, they gained tons of wealth during the Viking Age, causing a huge influx of money into Sweden itself. And then, once they developed their technology and society to equal the rest of Western Europe at the time, they managed to capitalize on a massive amount of until then untapped mineral wealth. And lastly, as I mentioned many times during the campaign section, paganism versus Catholicism was a centerpiece to Sweden's identity in the Middle Ages. Sweden was never able to establish a proper feudal system like the rest of Europe was. Its citizenry enjoyed a massive amount of freedom in comparison to European serfs, and it had a relatively weak and small noble population. These traditions came in large part both from its wealth and its pagan roots, and as such, Catholicism, even once it became the state religion, was not able to pervade the society to the same degree as the rest of Europe. Instead, Christianization was entirely a matter of convenience, giving them a seat at the greater European table and legitimizing their actions in the Baltic. But at the core of their traditions, their society, their very culture as a people, Sweden still had a fierce pagan heart that beat all through the Middle Ages, pretty much right up until the end of the AoE2 relevant time frame. And with that, we come to the end of the history section. If that's all you were here for, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe before you go. And for those of you who are interested, let's tackle the game mechanics. What does my build of the Swedes look like in Age of Empires 2? To begin, the Swedes are classified as a naval civilization. That isn't to say that navy is all they can do. They have a wide variety of other strengths that aren't quite clear enough to make it into their civilization classification. But on water, your navy is going to be your go-to and your greatest strength. They should have a naval dominance that in many ways echoes that of the current Vikings. To begin with, their infantry have bonus attack against cavalry. This is both a cheeky reference to the former chieftains technology, as well as a sideways reference to the Swedish commoners' defiance against noble hegemony. Moving on, their docks are 33% cheaper, and both docks and town centers are built 20% faster. This is, of course, an adapted version of the former Viking team bonus, with a little bit of extra juice to compensate for it no longer applying to all of your allies. As I've mentioned dozens of times, the Swedes were incredible shipbuilders, and their ability to colonize many of the areas that they raided I thought would be good to reference here as well, with those town centers building a little bit faster. Next, Heresy and Faith are both half off, and the first one that you research in a game unlocks a unique unit upgrade and grants a unique benefit to all of your units. For Heresy, you unlock the ability to research Halberdier, and all of your units get a little bit of extra bonus damage if they have any bonus damage to speak of. Faith, on the other hand, unlocks the ability to research Hussar and gives all of your units map-wide a very, very slow hit point regeneration. Substantially weaker to, but similar to a current Berserk. Now, obviously, this bonus references the divide between paganism and Catholicism, but it also demonstrates the Swedes' massive versatility and their ability to capitalize on religious conviction for economic and military means rather than just solely spiritual. Lastly, anytime you research a mining technology as the Swedes, you will gain an immediate lump sum of gold. 100 for feudal age mining technologies and 300 for castle age ones. This is, of course, in reference to their incredible mineral wealth, which they unlocked once they started to develop their infrastructure as a proper consolidated kingdom after the turn of the millennium. For a team bonus, coinage and banking will generate 3 or 5, for banking, free Vikings at the market of the player who researches them. Swedish Vikings were famed mercenaries, in addition to being merchants and raiders, and this will allow you and your allies to assemble a fairly substantial raiding corps of Vikings, either early in the game to harass your opponents before they can develop their economies, or in Castle Age as part of a concentrated push, similar to the Sicilian unique technology First Crusade, though substantially weaker. But what exactly is a Viking? Well, the Viking is a regional unit available to all Scandinavian civilizations. It costs 50 food and 10 gold, so fairly cheap, and it replaces your starting scout cavalry. You can even train more of them at the barracks from the Dark Age onwards. The Viking is slower than either a scout or an eagle warrior, but has slightly more line of sight than either of them. It's also a good deal weaker, with particularly low hit points. That being said, the Viking is able to generate gold whenever it attacks a villager, a monastery, a town center, a house, or a market. And it is also able to build a longship on water. You would place the longship like a building, it would build it, and then the longship would function exactly like a normal unit. What are longships exactly? Well, I'll get to that in a moment as well. But to finish off with the Viking, they are very weak to the sword and knight line, both of whom would have bonus damage against them, and they would benefit from supplies, having reduced food cost once you research that technology. Like other scout units, they would get a bonus in feudal age, but this bonus would still not make them very good fighters, probably still causing them to lose one-on-one versus even something like a militia, and definitely losing to a man-at-arms. But in Castle Age, you can upgrade them for 300 food and 100 gold to an elite Viking, which would not only be tougher and stronger, but would generate more gold when attacking the economic targets I listed earlier. So as the Swedes, the Vikings are going to be a big part of your strategy, especially since you get them in lump from your team bonus. The team bonus also lets your allies get those Vikings, as mentioned, getting benefits from the raiding bonus, and even allowing them to build longships, which are also a regional unit available to all Scandinavian civilizations. The longship costs 75 wood and 15 gold, and looks nothing like the current one we have in-game. Instead, it replaces the transport ship for those civilizations, being able to be trained at a dock, or built by a Viking individually, though when Vikings build them, they are slower than if they are trained at a dock, assuming you only have one Viking constructing. They are faster than a transport ship, quicker to make, but have substantially lower defenses. Their speed and ability to be constructed by a Viking in Dark Age will make them amazing at scouting out water maps. And they also have a weak attack, firing a small flurry of javelins at a low range. Like the current longship, the fact that they shoot a couple of projectiles will make them a little better against fire ships, but again, the damage and range are both quite poor, so you won't want to rely on them as military units unless you have to, with the exception of using them to raid enemy fishing fleets. They can be upgraded in Castle Age for 150 food and 300 wood to the Drakkar. This would use the current Viking longship model, and would be substantially faster and stronger, though still not enough to really hold its own against any sort of other proper warship. And so with 2 regional units at their disposal, the Swedes already have a fairly unusual field when compared to other current civilizations, and this is made even more interesting by their unique unit, the Varangian. This would be an infantryman built at the castle, costing 65 food and 40 gold. It would be comparable to a longsword, but substantially stronger, with higher hit points and attack. They also would receive bonus attack and armor versus all non-unique units. The Varangian Guard were famed for their fearsomeness in combat. Many people thought that they couldn't even be killed. Unique units would instead get a small attack bonus against Varangians. Not enough to be comparable to something like a samurai, but still enough to fell them quite quickly. And this would mean that once you tech into Varangians, you're effectively forcing your opponent to try to use their unique unit to counter you out. Additionally, the Varangian can even build longships, allowing them that little bit of extra versatility on hybrid or water maps. In the Castle Age, the Swedes also have the unique technology Skeg. This would make their ranged warships, namely anything besides demo or fire ships, deal trample damage whenever they shoot. This is obviously unusual because it's a projectile unit that has a melee trample, but it's in reference to these fearsome iron beards that the Swedes would clad the front of their ships with. And so during naval conflict, they would just kind of stick their ships in with each other and try to wedge them in and hole enemy ships, even as the men on board were lobbing projectiles at each other. I thought it was a pretty cool reference and will allow the Swedish Navy to play in a really unusual way come late game. In Imperial Age, the Swedes also have the technology Decree of Alsno. This would cause their knights to lose their entire food cost and take only half population space. Once the Swedes Europeanized under Birger Jarl, he and subsequent kings would impose new laws and regulations to make it such that the few nobles that the Swedes have would get massive tax breaks if they could provide armored horsemen in crusades and wartime. Those same nobles also enjoyed some quartering rights among the local populations. So this technology represents the kind of push for the Swedish nobility to help out in times of war by giving their knights special privileges. As always, if you want more details about any of these bonuses or the Swedes more broadly, check out the Civilization doc in the description. Moving on to their strengths. What would this build of the Swedes be good at? Well, unsurprisingly, first and foremost, from Dark Age onwards, they have exceptional raiding potential. Their starting scout can get you a little bit of gold and make some long ships. In Feudal Age, you can generate a whole ton of Vikings through coinage, and even by the time you hit late game, you still have a lot of raiding options at your disposal. You have your elite Vikings and your Varangians, of course, but you also have knights that take half population space, and you have the option to get hussars through faith. Regeneration is also especially good for raiding units, and so having that available for your entire force with faith will make that a huge pull if you plan on going long in the game and constantly harassing your opponent's eco. They also obviously have an amazing navy, a navy that might even rival the current Vikings. They have their cheap docks, they have their early longships, they can sneakily land soldiers everywhere because, again, longships do hold units like a transport ship. And late game, they have a very powerful death ball thanks to Skeg. When I say death ball, I mean when you clump all of your units together and move them in as a single indestructible force rather than splitting them up into a bunch of small raiding parties or sending in a constant trickle of dudes. And so imagine a whole ton of longships and galleons on the water all dealing trample damage whenever they attack. You can effectively just move straight into your enemy's navy and then start shooting, and they will absolutely melt. The only thing that the Swedes are missing on water is the fast fire ship and the elite cannon galleon, both of which do suck, but aren't going to be as useful for this Skeg death ball, and so you should still have an incredibly powerful option available to you come Imperial Age on the water. They also have very good infantry. I didn't think they had good enough infantry to call them an infantry civilization, but there are definitely many harkenings back to the power of the current Viking infantry in their design. They have that nice bonus versus cavalry, of course, and they also have a perfect tech tree if you choose to get heresy first instead of faith. The Varangian I also envision being very powerful, of course very weak to certain civilizations who already favor their unique units, but against others I think it could be as dominant as something like the Huskarl. Heresy also is especially good for infantry because a lot of infantry really relies on its bonus damage. The spear line has that high bonus damage against cavalry, of course, which the small amount gained through heresy isn't really going to be relevant for, but bear in mind that all infantry also does bonus damage against buildings, and heresy will augment that, allowing a mob of Swedish infantry to clear out an enemy town much faster than other civilizations would likely be able to. But that's not all the Swedes can do. They also have a couple of other lesser options available to them as well. Though not really a defined option per se, the Swedes are an incredibly adaptable civilization. They have a lot of decent options. They also have that swap between heresy and faith that really allows you to adjust your playstyle. If the game is going fast, you can go with heresy early on, where bonus damage through skirmishers and spears can really change the course of the game. And later on, you can get faith if you want to have that consistent HP regeneration and hussars for late game trash fights. The Swedes also have a very good economy. They have the faster built town centers, they get gold off of their mining ticks, a lot of small incremental bonuses that you might not necessarily notice while you're playing, but will make them feel a lot smoother through the ages. Their cheap, fast-built docks will also help their economy a lot out on water, and the only economic technology they miss is guilds, which shouldn't matter nearly as much for the Swedes because you do get a trickle of gold through your Vikings, assuming you're using them intelligently come late game. This is especially true in team games, where you're normally going to want to be picking up coinage and banking anyways, and for your troubles, you get a whole ton of Vikings that can generate you even more gold. I imagine this tribute tech strategy being actually very powerful in team games, where you can coordinate a massive raid together in Castle Age with a bunch of spontaneous Vikings. Hopefully less cancerous than First Crusade rushes on Arena at the very least. The Swedes also have a very interesting Cavalier flood strategy they can employ in late game after researching Decree of Alsna. They don't get better than Cavalier, but since they only cost gold, which you should hopefully be getting from your Vikings and your mining technologies, they should hypothetically be a relatively affordable unit as compared to other civilizations. They do, however, miss a lot of very important cavalry technologies, which I think is necessary to make this not absolutely oppressive. Those missing cavalry techs hint at one of the Swedes' several weaknesses. They are not a civilization without flaws, despite their versatility. For one, their siege is garbo. They miss all of the important siege upgrades, including siege engineers, which single-handedly has the ability to turn a mediocre siege civilization into a decent one. And so beyond Castle Age mangonels, I wouldn't recommend playing with siege as the Swedes. Additionally, they aren't very good on defense, missing a number of important technologies, though none of them make their defenses entirely unusable. You'll just be consistently on the back foot in Treb Wars, post-imperial situations, or those massive diplomacy games where everyone is spamming keeps and bombard towers everywhere. The Swedes also have pretty lousy cavalry. Kind of. They have weird cavalry. They don't have bloodlines or plate barding, so under normal circumstances, their cavalry is pretty garbage. They can't do scout rushes, they can't do castle knights. The only way that they can really get their cavalry online is if you go with Faith to get hussars, or you go with Decree of Ausna to get the special cavaliers, and both of those technologies are quite expensive. Admittedly, you are saving resources by not needing bloodlines or plate barding or paladin, but that doesn't really compensate for the fact that cavalry is not something you want to go to unless you are specifically teching into it as part of a grander strategy. So based on what we are seeing here in their strengths and weaknesses, what would the Swedish playstyle look like? Well, I think you know as well as I how the game would start. Lots of raiding. You're going to want to make your feudal age last as long as possible so that you can make optimal use of your many strong harassment options and your better than average early economy. You can do Drush into Vikings or archers. That's something that the Swedes can do just fine. And on water, you can get really aggressive. Vikings are still good because they can get dropped anywhere you want with your longships, but for the most part, the fact that you have those fast, cheap docks and you have longships as early as Dark Age can really allow the Swedes to take over the game very, very early if you're playing on a water map. Come mid-game, however, you have a number of decent, even if not incredible, options. Your crossbows are good, you have a little more gold to play with, and you can get your eco rolling faster, which is always going to help in that sort of Castle Age warfare scenario. And you have Varangians as well if you want to try to go for a death blow early on. It's going to be very hard for your opponent to tech into a unique unit in Castle Age, and so this is probably the best time for you to really heavily move into the Varangians, unless you're facing a civilization like the Khmer or something that have a really garbage unique unit. You do also have Heresy available if Castle Age gets prolonged, and you need to maximize your Castle Age power before teching into Imperial Age. And on top of all that, you have a very good boom. You have your faster TCs, you get the mining techs, you have the docks if you're on water, you have a lot of options available to you if you are trying to maximize your eco on a slower map. Just remember to keep on raiding while you are booming. A lot of civilizations play very passively when they're booming, but for the Swedes, raiding will actively improve your economy while it also weakens the opponent's. So minus something like Arena, you want to be making very proactive use of your Vikings in pretty much all situations. Come the late game, however, you really are going to have to start to mix things up. You don't quite have the power units of other civilizations, except for your barracks, and of course, as we know, infantry are underpowered in the current meta. So instead you'll have to get creative. Your range is quite serviceable, and your stable is decent if you tech into the right things, but you do need to make sure you are always raiding. You have your elite Vikings, you have Knights and Cavaliers if you go with Decree of Osna. Just make sure you are always harassing the opponent while your main army is handling them on the front lines. To this end, Faith will really help, and if you can make it into Imperial Age without needing to get Heresy, I would normally recommend you go with Faith instead, because not only will it get you constant incremental value through healing, but it makes your raiding all the better. And on water, of course, you know what you do come late game. You get a death ball of Galleons and Drakars, you go right into their navy and you kill everything, and it will be very fun and glorious until they make a single demo ship. And that about sums up my analysis of the Swedish playstyle. They're an unusual civ that doesn't have quite as many obvious power units and strong suits, so I'd love to hear how you think they would actually play out in a real game. Let's move on to a couple of loose threads. Ideas and thoughts that I had that didn't quite make it into the current build, as well as a couple of lingering questions that I didn't really find a good answer for as I was designing. To start with, the Viking and the Longship being regional units that both play very unusually could just end up being too complex or warping to the game. I do actually have it noted on my civilization document that the Longship can't actually attack until Feudal Age, but even so, having a pretty decent navy in Feudal already in your opponent's fishing line that just spontaneously starts shooting everywhere could still feel kind of oppressive. They also don't really have a lot of military bonuses, which feels weird for such a warlike people who define so much of their culture on raiding and honor and glory. Maybe a bit of a flavor fail there. And lastly, I have pushed the Swedes towards a lot of lesser used technologies, like Faith and Heresy, and coinage, and stone shaft mining, just a lot of weird things. And I'm worried that I maybe am pushing the player in too many unexplored directions all at once. Like, if I had just done one or two, I don't think it would have been a problem. But this many, it might be too much. Though I do like it. I do like it a lot as flavor for the civilization. I'm just not sure it is smart for design. Moving on to a couple of ideas that I had but decided not to go with. This was an interesting civilization because I knew almost exactly what I wanted it to feel like from the very beginning, but I cycled through a lot of different iterations of what that feel would actually manifest as in game mechanics. Like that mining bonus, I initially had it such that their unit upgrades would be faster and cheaper per miner that you had working at the time. That just felt too logistically fussy, so I decided to go with a simpler bonus instead. Similarly, I had an idea where you could sell relics at the market for a one-time huge gold boost rather than a trickle over time. It's a cool idea, don't get me wrong. You'll probably see this on an eventual Dane or Norwegian build that I do someday, but the Swedes didn't do quite as much of the old monastery pillaging thing, so it didn't quite feel right to have them defined by it. I also had the idea that the Decree of Osno would make your knights train much faster rather than having them take half population space. Both felt good. I could really go either way on this one, so tell me which one you like better. I also thought that it could be cool if the Viking needed to drop off gold like a trade cart, but again, logistical fussiness, and there's already precedent for raiding working this way through the Keshik. At one point, I even considered the Swedish team bonus as being that you share your raiding income with your allies, but it just felt useless in a single player game. Similarly, I even thought of maybe doing something where tributing could give free Vikings, but like I said, I'm already pushing people in weird directions with the Swedes. At one point as well, the longship was actually a melee unit that could also trade. And while I do think that melee ships are something the game needs to explore a lot more, this was yet another situation where I thought I might be introducing too much complexity all at once, especially having them be a transport unit, a trade unit. They can be built individually by Vikings on water. Just too much. I need to reel myself back in. My instincts say to go boom, to go out there, to do crazy things, but I think we all know, if you've watched even 2 of my builds by now, you know I already indulged too deeply in the unbridled sin of overcomplexity, so I must contain myself somehow. The Varangian also looked quite different at one point. I had them do anti-building damage, I had them refund their gold on death. There was a lot of different ways they could have looked. The unique unit thing felt the coolest to me. The Swedes needed a good power unit that they could rely on but wouldn't be uncounterable, and for me the Varangian was just the clear way to implement that in a reasonable fashion. They also had a couple of different unique technologies I was considering. One called Birkarls, which would just make deer spawn everywhere on the map and give you gold whenever anyone hunted them. Fun! I really like the idea, but adds too much chaos to the game. I really like this perhaps on like a Sami build if I were ever to do that someday, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I also had the idea for a technology called Bardi, which would make it so that ships would get bonus armor when they were bunched up together. Just another incarnation of the Swedish late-game ship death ball that I think Skeg does a better job of being more dynamic with. And lastly, I had a technology called Politisvarf, which would give you a single gold lump sum whenever you destroyed an enemy town center, and an even bigger one whenever you killed a castle. This was in reference to Varangians getting the first pick of an emperor's treasure whenever he died, and while I liked it quite a bit, it felt a little too snowbally. Plus, I was pretty comfortable with the 2 unique technologies by that point and didn't really want to go with a potentially risky alternative. And with that, we come to the end of our Swedish build. Thank you so much for watching. I very much hope you enjoyed it. Let's take a quick gander over at the old likelinyometer. In my opinion, how likely on a scale of 1 to 10 is it that the Swedes as a civilization could be implemented in Age of Empires 2 in the future, especially looking a little bit like the build that I have for them now? And on the likelinyometer for the Swedes, we have a 7 out of 10. While I think that there is some chance that the Swedes are implemented, even a pretty okay one, I could see them being implemented very differently from how I've done them. I have them as a bit of a jack of all trades that has a lot of different funky options with a bit of an economy sub-theme, and I could see a lot of people making them a lot more standard infantry and ship civilization, much more similar to the current Vikings than what I have done with them. I would love to see the AoE2 team subdivide the Vikings like they have done with the Indians. I think it's an obvious choice, even if I think that other civilizations like the Saracens and the Slavs deserve it just a little bit more. Oh, and especially the Chinese, but we'll get to that in a future video. So how do you like my build? What would you have done differently in your design of the Swedes? Are there any historical elements that I missed or that you would implement in a totally different way? And do you think that this civilization would be overpowered, or that the Viking and longship regional unit combo would be too weird and oppressive? Either way, I would love to hear your opinions down in the comment section below. Show some love, and of course, let me know what civilization, what unit, what anything you would like me to tackle next in another theory crafting vid in the future. But until that point, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.